The days after their reunion felt unreal to Daniel and Elena. The city outside went on as if nothing had changed. People hurried to work. The trams still rang their metallic bells. The leaves turned and fell. But for them, time seemed to open a new chapter. Elena had returned to his side, not as a fleeting dream, but as a living presence. She still carried the quiet strength Daniel had always admired, the one hidden under her graceful gestures and warm gaze. For days, Daniel found himself staring at her across the kitchen table, in the reflection of cafe windows, even in the dull glow of the metro. And every time, she smiled, as though she could hear his thoughts. "You keep looking at me," she teased one evening while they walked through a park dusted with early snow. "I'm afraid if I blink, you'll disappear again," Daniel admitted. "Then I guess I'll just have to hold your hand tighter," she replied, slipping her fingers through his, sealing the promise with warmth. At first, their love was made of small, ordinary miracles. They cooked dinner together in Daniel's apartment, where Elena insisted on rearranging the spices in his kitchen. She claimed it was chaos. He claimed it was order. They laughed until their sides hurt. They made lists of movies they had missed while apart, watching them late into the night with blankets wrapped around them. They rediscovered music, his old records, her playlists, and created a new shared soundtrack, each song marking the rediscovery of us. But beneath the sweetness lingered an unspoken question. What now? Daniel worked long hours, his photography beginning to gain recognition. Elena, meanwhile, carried her own dreams. She wanted to publish her writing, stories she had scribbled in notebooks during their separation. They both felt the tug of individual paths, but now they were intertwined. One evening, Elena placed a worn notebook on the table. "These are my stories," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "You've never shown anyone?" Daniel asked, flipping the cover gently, as though the pages were fragile wings. "No one. Not until now. I was afraid." "Of what?" "That they weren't good enough. That they'd never matter." Daniel looked up, his eyes full of the same certainty that once drew her back to him. "They matter to me. And if they matter to me, they'll matter to others." Elena smiled, though tears shimmered at the edges of her eyes. For the first time, she believed him. Their days became a careful balance of love and ambition. Elena wrote in cafes, her pen dancing across pages as snow fell outside. Daniel photographed winter streets, strangers lost in thought, children chasing each other through the frost. At night, they shared what they had created, cheering each other on. Yet, the more they dreamed, the more reality whispered. Bills piled on the counter. Deadlines pressed Daniel. Rejection slipped into Elena's inbox. And in the silence between them, fear crept in. One night, after Daniel returned from a late assignment, he found Elena awake, staring at her laptop. The glow painted her face in pale blue light. "Another rejection?" he asked gently. She nodded. "They said my writing is too sentimental, too unrealistic." "Then they don't understand love," Daniel said. "And that's their loss." But Elena sighed. "What if they're right?" Daniel crossed the room and kissed her forehead. "Then I'll remind you every day that they're wrong." Their bond was strong, but love, as they both knew, wasn't just warmth. It was also weathering storms. The first real storm came unexpectedly. Daniel was offered a photography exhibition in Berlin, a chance to step into the international scene. He was thrilled, but when he told Elena, her smile faltered. "That's incredible," she said softly. "You don't sound excited." "I am. But Berlin means months away. What happens to us?" Daniel reached for her hand. "I don't want to lose what we've rebuilt. But this is everything I've worked for." "And what about everything I'm working for?" Elena whispered, pulling her hand back. The silence that followed was heavy. For the first time since their reunion, they felt the distance between their dreams. Days turned into weeks, and the tension grew. Daniel tried to downplay Berlin, but Elena saw the light in his eyes whenever he spoke about it. She wanted to be supportive, but a deep fear gnawed at her. The fear that love might once again be sacrificed to ambition. One evening, after another quiet dinner, Elena finally said what she had been holding back. "I don't want to stand in your way, Daniel. If Berlin is your dream, you should go." "But what about our dream?" he asked. "Maybe they're not the same," she replied, her voice trembling. Her words cut through him like glass. He wanted to argue, to convince her that love and dreams could coexist. But in that moment, he wasn't sure. Winter deepened. Snow blanketed the city, muffling its usual noise, but inside their apartment the silence grew louder. They still touched, still kissed, but something unspoken lingered. An ache beneath the sweetness. One night, Daniel stood by the window, staring at the frost patterns like maps of a world he couldn't navigate. Elena joined him, her arms wrapping around his waist. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Of what?" "That we'll end up losing each other again. That love isn't enough." Daniel turned, pressing his forehead to hers. "Maybe love isn't enough," he admitted. "But it's all I know how to fight for." Elena closed her eyes, holding him as though he were both her anchor and her storm. When the new year arrived, they made a choice, not spoken in words but felt in the way they clung to each other at midnight. Daniel would go to Berlin, but Elena would not stay behind. She would finish her manuscript and bring it with her. Searching for publishers abroad. It was reckless. It was terrifying. But it was them. "We'll either break," Elena said, half smiling, "or we'll prove everyone wrong." "We've already proven that once," Daniel answered, kissing her under the fireworks outside their window. The weeks that followed were filled with preparation. Passports, tickets, packing. Daniel's photographs stacked neatly in portfolios. Elena's manuscript printed, bound with trembling hands. The apartment that had sheltered their reunion grew emptier with each box sealed. The night before their departure, they returned to the bookshop where it had all begun. The shelves stood quiet, dust shimmering in the lamplight. "Do you remember?" Elena asked. "I remember everything," Daniel replied. They sat in the same corner, side by side. And for a moment it felt as though time had folded in on itself, past and present blending into one eternal promise. "Whatever happens in Berlin," Elena whispered, "don't let me go." "Never again," Daniel swore, his voice steady as stone. And so, with hearts both heavy and hopeful, they stepped into the unknown together. The city lights faded beneath the airplane's wings, and in the quiet hum of departure, Daniel and Elena held hands. Facing the uncertain skies, the city of Berlin greeted them with cold winds and restless streets. Skyscrapers rose like glass monuments, and trams wove their way through the avenues with a rhythm Daniel and Elena hadn't yet learned to follow. For two souls bound together by memory and hope, the city felt both promising and overwhelming. Daniel carried his portfolio under his arm like a lifeline. Elena carried her manuscript, its weight heavier than the paper suggested. They had left behind the familiarity of home to chase something fragile yet necessary. A future built not on fear, but on courage. Their first weeks in Berlin were a blur of rented rooms, late-night planning, and countless small adjustments. The language was foreign, the customs different. Grocery stores closed earlier than they expected. Trains arrived with an efficiency that left no room for hesitation. They laughed at their mistakes, though sometimes the laughter was tinged with exhaustion. That Daniel's exhibition preparation consumed much of his time. He met with curators, printers, and fellow photographers. He returned home with stories of strangers who admired his work, of opportunities opening like doors he had long dreamed of knocking on. Elena listened, proud but also painfully aware of her own uncertainties. She spent her days in cafes, polishing her manuscript, sending queries to publishers, and staring out at streets that didn't yet feel like hers. Each rejection that returned stung more sharply in this foreign land, where loneliness pressed harder against her heart. One evening, Daniel returned late, the smell of wine and cigarette smoke clinging to his jacket from a gallery event. Elena sat by the window, her laptop closed, her face shadowed by the city's neon glow. "You're late," she said softly. "I know. I lost track of time." "You've been losing track of time a lot lately." Daniel froze, guilt rippling through him. He wanted to explain, to tell her how necessary these connections were, how every conversation felt like another step toward his dream. But the words caught in his throat. Elena's voice trembled. "I feel like I'm disappearing, Daniel. Like I'm just waiting in the background while you live the life you always wanted." Daniel dropped his bag and moved closer, cupping her face. "You are my life, Elena. Everything I'm doing for us. Then why does it feel like I'm not part of it?" The silence that followed stretched between them like an ocean. Days passed, and though they still loved fiercely, the cracks widened. Daniel's exhibition approached. and his attention was pulled deeper into the art world. Elena, meanwhile, began doubting not only her writing but her place in Berlin. She sent manuscripts to publishers, attended small literary meetups, but the rejections piled higher. One night, overwhelmed, she wandered the snowy streets alone. The city lights blurred through her tears. She ended up in a small bookstore tucked between two stone buildings, its windows glowing warm against the winter night. Inside, the scent of paper and ink enveloped her, and she felt a strange comfort. She sat between the shelves, pulling a book at random, her fingers trembling. The shopkeeper, an older woman with kind eyes, approached. "You look like someone carrying a story," the woman said in accented English. Elena laughed bitterly. "I carry too many stories. None of them wanted." The woman placed a hand on her shoulder. "Stories don't choose where they're wanted. They choose the heart they belong to. Keep writing. Someone will listen." For the first time in weeks, Elena felt hope stir again. Meanwhile, Daniel's exhibition opened to acclaim. Crowds gathered, critics scribbled notes, and photographers shook his hand. His work, intimate captures of city life, fleeting expressions, shadows, and light, hung proudly on the walls. Yet as the evening stretched on, his gaze kept flickering toward the door, searching for Elena. When she finally arrived, wrapped in her long coat, cheeks flushed from the cold, his heart lifted. But he saw something in her eyes, a distance, a quiet struggle that unsettled him. "You're late," he whispered when she reached him. "I know," she replied. Echoing his own words from nights before, they smiled faintly. But beneath the smile was a truth neither wanted to voice. They were moving at different speeds, chasing different lights. The turning point came weeks later. Elena received an email from a small publishing house in London. They wanted to meet her. It wasn't a contract, not yet, but it was a door, her own door. Excited and nervous, she showed Daniel. His reaction was supportive but distracted. He was already preparing for a second exhibition, this time in Paris. "That's amazing," he said, kissing her cheek. "Just amazing?" she pressed. "Elena, I'm proud of you. Truly. But Paris, this could be the next big step for me. Timing is everything." Her smile faltered. For the first time, she wondered if their dreams were pulling them apart instead of weaving them together. They argued that night. Harsh words cut deeper than either intended. Elena accused Daniel of caring more about his career than their relationship. Daniel accused Elena of not understanding the sacrifices he had to make. Finally, Elena whispered the words she had feared for months. "What if love isn't enough, Daniel?" His chest ached as if struck. He wanted to shout, to prove her wrong, but all he could manage was, "Then tell me what is enough." She had no answer. Tears slipped down her face as she turned away. The days that followed were fragile. They still shared the same bed, still reached for each other's hands, but the warmth was shadowed by doubt. Elena traveled to London for her meeting, leaving Daniel behind in Berlin. The distance between them was no longer measured in kilometers, but in faith. In London, Elena sat across from editors who praised her voice but demanded changes. They wanted less sentiment, more sharpness. She agreed, though every compromise felt like carving away pieces of her soul. Meanwhile, in Paris, Daniel stood beneath bright lights. His photographs admired by strangers, yet his heart ached with emptiness. Success without Elena beside him felt hollow. One night, separated by cities, they called each other. The silence over the phone was heavier than words. "Are we losing this?" Elena whispered. "No," Daniel said quickly. "I won't let us. But what if it's already slipping? Then I'll hold on harder." Tears blurred her vision as she clutched the phone. "Promise me, Daniel. Promise me we won't let ambition kill what we rebuilt." "I promise," he said, his voice breaking. Months passed, testing them in ways they hadn't imagined. Elena's book was finally accepted, though heavily edited. Daniel's photography spread across Europe. His name whispered among circles he had only dreamed of, but the truest victory came not from their separate successes, but from their decision to return to each other, to the balance they had once sought. They chose a smaller apartment, quieter lives. Daniel still traveled for exhibitions, but he always returned home. Elena continued to write, but on her own terms, her voice intact. On a rainy evening, back in Berlin, Daniel found Elena sitting by the window, her notebook open. He knelt beside her, slipping a small velvet box into her hand. Her breath caught as she opened it, a simple ring. Nothing extravagant, but full of meaning. "Elena," Daniel said, his voice steady. "I don't know where our dreams will take us. I don't know how many storms we'll face. But I know I want to face them all with you. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down her cheeks as she whispered, "Yes. 1,000 times yes." Their love was never perfect, never easy. But it was real. It was tested and tempered, like steel forged in fire. And in the end, that made it unbreakable. As seasons turned. As books were published and photographs hung on walls across cities, Daniel and Elena carried with them the truth they had learned. Love wasn't about choosing between dreams. Love was about building them together.